All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast, where we're doing some Big East team previews. We've got my favorite team, actually, tonight, the UConn Huskies. If you're enjoying our content, please make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate all the support we've gotten so far. And we'll dive right into the offensive strengths, starting with Marcus here.
Yeah, before I start, just let everybody know Nate became a fan right after they won their first national title 2 years ago. Yeah, just kidding. Just
kidding. That was like their fourth.
Not a bandwagon. He's a dedicated Husky fan. But now this UConn team, as you're gonna I think find out in this episode, we think is really good. I think the offense in particular, has a lot of depth, a lot of shooting. As we've touched on in all the episodes from last year, even though UConn kind of had their issues offensively, we still believed in the coaching staff kind of dialing up exactly what it took for UConn to still compete and win games. And quite honestly, like, they won plenty of games and stuck around in plenty of games that they probably shouldn't have because of just the coaching staff's ability to just draw up great sets. I mean, anybody that watched the game against Florida in the round of 32, like, even though like UConn controlled most of that game, and they were up 5-6 points the whole game, and it really felt like it was 15 because they just seemed to be able to score a bucket whenever they needed to. But that really just goes to show, I think, this coaching staff, Coach Hurley, his assistants, the amount of time and energy they put into constructing an offense that works, a system that works. And, this year they're going to especially love it because they have, great shooting, and solo ball, of course. Silas Demery, who's coming over from Georgia, 37% 3-point shooter. Caravan, who had a down year last year from three, but I would expect him to kind of bounce back. And then you've got Braylon Mullins coming in as a freshman, who I'll let Cody speak more to him, but he can shoot it from very deep range. Has a lot to his offensive game. And then, back that up with the front court, who can get all over the offensive glass in Taris Reed, who had a 17.5% offensive rebound rate. That's pretty remarkable. And then the freshman, Eric Reeb, I think is how you say it. I'm not exactly sure, but those two up front should be pretty impactful on the offensive glass for an offense that should be super efficient. So, I think this UConn offense is incredibly dangerous for this year coming up.
Cody, anything you want to add strength-wise?
Yeah, I mean, the shooting is going to be awesome. I mean, I think we all know that, and it typically has been the last 3 years with during this not dominant run, because obviously last year went a little bit off the rails compared to what UConn has expected in its recent history. But I do think this is a very talented shooting team led by Solo Ball, Caravan, and Braylon Mullins. One note to add about Caravan's shooting season last year: he shot at 34.7% from three, but he had a 7 for 47 stretch from January 18th to February 18th. And to still finish 35% from three is rather remarkable. Like, I remember me and Marcus texting back and forth about Caravan's shooting around. We were questioning whether he was a good shooter or not. Like, he just kind of looked lost as a shooter. I think it was the Creighton game where they were just kind of leaving him open. That's like one of the last guys in the country I would expect for a team to leave open. And I know Creighton's like more analytically driven. They're like, if this guy's not going to make threes, we're just going to make him knock one down. But ultimately,
it hit a point, right, where we were like, is he ever going to make a three again? Right.
Yeah. I mean, he only made 7 in a month stretch and attempted 47 of them. It's just the fact that he shot 35% from three still is pretty remarkable. And I think he's in a much better spot this season to shoot it like 40% plus because he's going to play in less of a role. There's some other advantage creators on this roster now in Silas Demery and Malachi Smith coming off the bench, who I think are going to be extremely important to unlocking like the final piece that this offense was missing last year. This was still a great offense, but with a guy like Hassan Diarra running the show, he's just not the greatest creator, like getting downhill. Like he's a talented passer, but it's just a matter of like getting into the lane consistently and creating for someone else. Nobody really respected his rim scoring ability, but there are two guys here in Silas Demery and Malachi Smith who can get downhill against almost anyone and be able to create on the fly, make decisions while they're in the air and find open shooters. So I do think they're going to be much better. They're going to be much more well-rounded. And I know Demery's numbers weren't fantastic and he's not like a super high level passer, but I think he's going to be able to create more with his ability to get downhill. But I'll just be honest, when you play in a Mike White offense, it's kind of hard to be super efficient as a guard. There's just not a ton of spacing in that offense. It's like, it's pretty chaotic, honestly. And Demery kind of had to do a lot of that himself as a guard. I mean, he had a 17.9% assist rate and compared to 18.9% turnover rate in his 2 years at Georgia. I expect those numbers to I expect maybe a 25% assist rate with a 15% turnover rate just because of all the spacing he has around him this year. So, and that's another area that they're going to improve is taking care of the ball. They had a few games last year where it was rough taking care of the ball. The back-to-back stretch against Marquette and against St. John's, it was very ugly. I think they had like a 35% turnover rate in those two games. It was 38% against Marquette and 32% against St. John's in back-to-back games. And it just looked extremely rough. When you have a backcourt of Diarra and like Aiden Mahaney when he was sliding into minutes, like they just weren't ready for the athleticism. They don't have the ball handling creativity to really avoid those turnovers. And one final thing I'll touch on is Braylon Mullins. I think he's the most talented shooter in this class, and not really sure it's all that close. I mean, particularly as an off-ball shooter, he shot at 47% in the 3 SSB league, I believe, in an AAU league, and he shot at 43% or better in his last three, his last 3 high school seasons on extremely high volume. And he's a super talented off-ball shooter, and he's really good in the dribble handoff game. So I think this is pretty much a match made in heaven in the UConn offense that doesn't rely on any particular guy dominating the ball in the pick and roll game. It's all predicated off of off-ball motion and through that dribble handoff game with guys like, Taurus Reed's going to be operating a little bit there, which I'm not completely sure is going to look great all the time, but I just think all these guys are going to be able to work off of each other so well, and they space the floor extremely well. And I think this is probably the most well-rounded offense in the country.
What concerns you with this offense? And we'll start with Marcus here.
Yeah. While I do think it will be improved, I still think that the turnovers could be a little bit of an issue. I think just like looking at the raw numbers of like Silas Demery and Malachi Smith in particular, like both kind of hovered around that 20% turnover rate last year. I know Malachi Smith was closer to, I believe, like 24, was it? 19 overall, but 25 in top 50 games. So I think it's still a little bit of a concern. I think a little bit less of a concern because they have more on-ball guys now. And I think like solo ball really took a big leap last year that will also help both of those guys on the ball. So, I'm really high on this offense, and Cody, it sounds like you are too, as I think everyone should be. So there's not a ton that really concerns me. But I think that the turnovers could still be a little bit of a problem. And, we saw last year that game you were talking about, Cody, at Marquette, like they are lucky that solo ball was red hot that night, because like if there were, I forget what you even said. I think you said if there was like 5 more minutes in that game, they would have lost, because just like Marquette was turning them over pretty much every other possession, it felt like. and then scoring at will at the other end. Like there's so much momentum on Marquette's side that they just ran out of time.
Cody, what are you concerned about with this UConn offense?
Yeah, just to speak on that Marquette game for a second. I mean, they turned it over 38% of the time, but they shot it 12 for 19 from three, and they had a 50% offensive rebound rate. So, I mean, obviously those two things are going to kind of save the day, and they still have those two qualities that can save them in any situation. But yeah, they're going to need to clean it up, and it is still probably their one area of concern. I said ball security relative to the elites of college basketball in this area. I think it's very much improved from their 173rd mark in the nation last year with the additions of Demery and Smith. I know they have, like, their numbers aren't fantastic in the turnover area, but I just think their ball handling talents and their ability to create in the lanes is going to be extremely valuable compared to a guy like Diarra, who was kind of just a facilitator. He was certainly more pass first, but he was just out there to kind of make sure the offense was getting into the right guy's hands. And while I think Demery and Malachi Smith are going to be able to actually make plays for this team this upcoming season. And one other weakness I had mentioned was I think they're potentially a thin bench. There's not a ton after Malachi Smith. I mean, Jalen Stewart played a little bit of a role, shot it well on kind of low volume, but I would expect a little bit of a leap with extra opportunity and extra spacing. I think they're all going to help each other out in that area. And then Jaden Ross played a little bit, wasn't really all that efficient. And then some guys off the bench who are somewhat of unknown. I think Jacob Furphy can play a role as a shooter, but not completely sure what else he's going to provide besides his off-ball shooting. And Eric Ryby, I think he's going to play a role as a pick and pop piece, but just he's a thinner frame and doesn't move in space particularly well. So I'm not completely sure what his role is going to look like. And for a guy in Taurus Reed who tends to get in foul trouble, and he got in foul trouble quite a bit last year. He was 5.7 fouls per 40, 5.5 fouls per 40 was the actual number. Like, if he's going to run into foul trouble and only play 20 minutes a game and Eric Ryby's not ready, what are they going to do with the 5 position? I think would be another concern. And overall, I just think the bench is a little thin.
All right, let's talk defensively now. Marcus, what do you have for strengths?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually just going to piggyback off what Cody said real quick. I know it's not a strength, but I think it's a very valid point on the defensive end as well, of like the front court depth, particularly where Taurus Reed is oftentimes in foul trouble. It felt like just about every game I watched last year of UConn, Taurus Reed was heading to the bench with 2 fouls, heading to the bench with 3 after he picked it up in the first 2 minutes of the second half. Like, I think it's a real concern this year. I mean, it was last year. I think it's even more so this year because there's more uncertainty in the front court. And like Ryby, like you said, is really the only other guy, other than like Caravan over 6'8", and Caravan's not a big. So it's a little bit concerning, I think, because inevitably, unless Dan Hurley has cleaned that up with Taurus Reed and, gotten him more disciplined this offseason, which I would be hard pressed to think that he has, considering, the 3 years he's had. I'd be shocked, but I think that's a real concern on both sides of the ball, like to your point. But the strengths here, I think, the wings should be extremely like switchable between like Caravan, Ball, like Mullins. I like Demery's a bigger guard. I think they're going to be able to do a lot of things on the wings, because they have just positional size, right? I mean, Ball's 6'3", and he's really going to be the shortest guy that plays for them. Everyone else is 6'5" or taller. Caravan's 6'8". It's a rather big team on the wings and at the guard spots, so that should certainly help. And then like Reed last year was what, like a 9% block rate. Like he can impact at the rim, and he's also a great defensive rebounder. So when he's on the floor, like that's an obvious strength, 9% block rate and 27% defensive rebound rate. So I think those are clear strengths on that end. They should rebound pretty well as a unit on the defensive end.
Anything to add, Cody, strength wise?
Yeah, I mean, I think the strength is they just improved across the board. I mean, I think particularly in the point of attack defense area, this was a real issue for them last year, and I think it led to a lot of the foul trouble for the big men. They finished like in the 300s in foul rate, which is for the scheme that Hurley deploys, like fouling that much is a real issue. Like if you're not going to force turnovers at a high clip and you're going to foul at a super high clip, it just creates for somewhat of a disaster. And relative to past Hurley defenses, this was a disaster. I mean, they finished 80th in adjusted defense on Torvik, but ultimately I do think they improved in the point of attack defense. It's going to be a big reason why. Hassan Diarra was great, but it was a roster last year that lacked the depth in this area, and I think they do have it. And it starts with Silas Demery for me. He was the best perimeter defender on a really good Georgia defense, and Malachi Smith as his backup isn't like fantastic, but he's an upgrade over a guy like Aiden Mahaney, and I think his fiery mentality off the bench is going to be really nice. And yeah, I had a nice little note on Aiden Mahaney. I called him a traffic cone, so that's probably, I think Malachi Smith is a little bit of an upgrade there. Braylon Mullins, I think he's a real plus athlete. I think he possesses some defensive playmaking ability as well. He's a little bit thin, but he's a springy athlete at 6'5" with length, and I think that's more than a lot of guys on UConn's roster last year can say. And defending in space again is important in this scheme, and I think UConn is much improved in this area. Marcus mentioned the defensive rebounding improvements, and I think just getting more Taurus Reed minutes is going to be really important, because when they went to Samson Johnson off the bench, he had a 13.3% defensive rebound rate, and yeah, he played nearly half the minutes. And I would expect Reed, if he can stay out of foul trouble, to play close to 60 to 65% of the minutes, as opposed to the 50% that he played last year. So that's automatically going to improve the defensive rebounding. Plus, Ryby is a real improvement just with his overall size in that area. UConn finished 74th in defensive rebound rate last year, and I think they can also do it by committee with the positional size on the wings. One final thing I had mentioned was I actually do think this team's going to foul a little bit less, partly because of the point of attack defense, and partly because I do think Taurus Reed has it in him to stay out of foul trouble with a higher volume of minutes. He proved it at Michigan, I will say. I mean, he committed just 3.9 fouls per 40 minutes compared to a 5.5 number last season. So at least if he was staying on the floor for 40 minutes, he wasn't fouling out on average. So I think that's a really good step in the right direction. A guy like Samson Johnson, he was more of a hack than Taurus Reed was. Like, let's be honest. I mean, Samson Johnson was 6.1 fouls per 40, and he's out the door now. And I think the replacement of Ryby, who he's more of a positional defender and he's more of a primary rim anchor, I think that's going to lead to less fouling. And yeah, I do have the number here. They were 342nd in free throw attempt rate allowed, which is 20th from the bottom. So I do think with these defensive improvements and on the wings and the emphasis of not fouling, so particularly from Taurus Reed, just because he knows that he's going to be the guy up front and he needs to stay on the floor, I do think that means something.
What's concerning about this defense? Marcus, we'll go with you.
I kind of already hit on it. I think it's the foul trouble, just on the surface, and the lack of interior depth. Like having only two guys with Reed's foul track record from last year. Like while Cody said, it appears as though it could get better. Like we can only go based off of what we've seen up to this point, and that is him fouling out when he plays 40 minutes or less, honestly, right? He's over 5 fouls per 40. So I think that's really the main concern, and not really having like a proven backup like Ryby, I think could be fine, and he's going to have to play a role. But like I talked about, other than that, it's a little bit of a question mark because there really isn't a ton of other like bigs size. So that's a concern. And then I don't know, like with this one's just kind of more not necessarily a concern, but something that they could run into. With a team that is a 3-point shooting team, a team that shoots it well from the outside. Like they're going to have their cold nights, and oftentimes like long shots lead to long rebounds, right? And so transition defense could potentially be a little bit of a problem night to night if they're relying more on the 3 ball, especially if like Tarse Reed's in foul trouble and they're not able to play through him at all. They're going to be playing more of a perimeter oriented game. Could lead to more like runouts and such. And if they're not taking care of the basketball, same thing. So I think that could be, but that's more just like a forecast than like a actual weakness, I think.
Cody, anything you want to add weakness wise?
Yeah, those are valid points, but I don't view this team as a team that gets 3-point reliant, because I think they have an elite 2-point offense as well, because there's a ton of back cuts within this offense as well. And if Tarse Reed is getting on the offensive glass and like getting rid of those runouts for opposing offenses, I think they're going to be okay. And transition defense is always like a key emphasis in a Dan Hurley defense. So ultimately, I think they'll be okay. There are some situations where they're going to shoot it poorly. There's going to be long rebounds, and there's nothing they could do, which it's more forecasting than anything. So that does make a ton of sense. But the one thing I had listed besides the front court depth, which Marcus touched on, was their turnover forcing. It's mostly scheme driven, but there's still a lack of high level athletes across the board on this roster. Outside of like Demery, I like Mullins as an athlete, and Stewart's a solid athlete on the wing. I do think they're a little bit lacking. Like Solo Ball isn't like the greatest athlete. Caravan isn't the greatest lateral mover. So, and I don't think they're going to be as aggressive as a defense. Like when Samson Johnson was on the floor, they were able to play a little more aggressively in pick and roll. But now that they don't have the depth and they don't have like a really great lateral mover at the 5, it's going to have to be more of a base drop coverage and, be a little more analytically driven where other teams are going to be getting shots. It's going to be a lot of off the dribble in the mid range and kind of just rely on the analytical game more than actually trying to force turnovers.
All right, we're going to move right along to your MVP and X Factor. Marcus, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I actually went with one of the newcomers to be the MVP. I went Silas Demery for a few reasons. One, I think on the defensive end, he's going to be really important to this backcourt in guarding, the other team's best guard. Like he's 6'5", long, high steal rate, can really, I think, impact the game on that end for UConn. And then on the offensive end, he's going to be playing in a much more efficient system. He's going to be playing around far, far better players that can shoot the ball, when he gets downhill, or it's just going to lead to, I think, more efficient offense for him. Like you touched on, not overly efficient at Georgia, just a 48.5% effective field goal percentage. But I think the talent is there. I think the playmaking is there. As long as he's going to take care of the basketball, I think he's going to be really, the most important player to this team on both ends of the floor. But I also think that there are a lot of ways you could go with this, because I think at the top there are, several players that, you could argue any which ways are going to be very, very important to the success of the Huskies. And then, my X factor, I went with Braylon Mullins as, a freshman coming in. I think his shooting ability is enough to make him the X factor in and of itself. I think he's going to be able to provide a lot for this team on both ends, but in particular on the offensive end, just as a floor spacer, elite shot maker, and athlete. So I think he's going to fit right in right away, and going to make UConn very dangerous.
Cody, let's hear your MVP and X Factor.
Yeah, I actually have two different ones, but I think you could have gone a lot of different ways for both. I think ultimately, I think it was between Demery, Alex Caravan, or like a Taurus Reed, or maybe even Braylon Mullins, depending on how high you are on him. But ultimately, I went with Caravan as the MVP because I just think he's going to get back to his old shooting ways. And is that going to be because of the help he has? Yes, but I do think there's truly a chance that he gets to like 43, 44% 3-point shooting and his ability as a connector piece on the offensive end. You can put the ball in his hands and he can make decisions in the dribble handoff game. He's played small ball 5 for Hurley before, and that was on that when Klingon went to when he was hurt with that foot injury, he was able to play the small ball 5, and he was like somewhat of the engine of that offense, and he held his own defensively as well, which was rather impressive. I just think he does a lot of things well that don't really go noticed. He's the smartest player on the floor in pretty much any game that he's playing in. So ultimately, I went with him as the MVP. And for my X Factor, I think it was a little more obvious for me just because it's Taurus Reed. I think he has to be very, very good, and he has to stay out of foul trouble because we don't know what Eric Ribey is going to be at this point in time. I think, to be honest, I think Taurus Reed's probably the biggest swing piece or X factor to his own team in the entire country. Because I think what he provides on the offensive glass isn't replaceable on this roster. What he provides as a rim protector isn't really replaceable either. It's just a matter of, can he stay on the floor and can he maintain his productivity when he's playing 70 to 75% of the minutes, or if he's playing 30 to 35 minutes in any given game, can he maintain his offensive rebounding ways, and can he be a true rim anchor that this team really needs? Because they're not really going to force a ton of turnovers. They're going to filter in a lot of the offense to him, or a lot of opposing offenses are going to be filtered into him. So I do think ultimately he's one of the most important players to his very team in the country.
All right, finally, let's hear the ceiling and floor and a bold prediction if you got one, Marcus.
All right, I'm going to start first in conference. Ceiling, win the conference. Floor, second. I think it's very, very clearly a 2-team race in the Big East with St. John's and UConn. St. John's we'll cover later on. But other than that, like, I don't really see like Creighton or Marquette or really anybody else threatening Xavier, threatening UConn for either of the top 2 spots. So I think that's very clear. I think as for on the national scale, I think the ceiling is a title. I think this team could win it. They have a ton of offense. Obviously, there's some drawbacks because of the front court. If Taurus Reed is able to stay on the floor, very, very important. But, I think the floor, because of how good the offense is going to be, I think Sweet 16 is kind of the floor. I'd be shocked if they didn't make it to the second weekend with this team, with all the talent that it has. So that's where I'm going to go.
All right, Cody, now let's hear your ceiling and floor for the Huskies.
Yeah, I have a similar opinion to Marcus. I think in conference, their floor is second, maybe third, if I'm like completely wrong about some of the other teams in this league. I don't see it going that poorly. I think it's UConn or St. John's to win this league, and I'm willing to bet that it's going to be UConn because I do think their ceiling is winning this league, even by multiple games, and potentially running away with this league and making a Final Four and a potential national championship. I'm still like a little bit skeptical because of some of the defensive concerns on the wings. It's not perfect, obviously. And then we've talked about Reed's foul trouble concerns and the rim protection behind him. There's just there's just some concerns in the back of my head that make me think that they aren't like a tier 1 title contender. I think they're very, very close, and maybe in that back end of tier 1, but there are some concerns there. And I had their floor as like I said, second in the Big East, maybe third, and a first weekend exit if the defense is similar to last year's.
A bold prediction?
Yeah, I said they win the Big East by multiple games, and I think they finish with the best offense in the nation.
Oh wow!
All right.
It's between them and like Purdue, and I don't think there's like, I think there's a couple offenses that are like well ahead of the pack, but I don't think there's a thing that UConn does poorly. Like when they're missing, I mean, they're going to make close to 40% of their threes, and even when they miss their threes, their Taurus Reed is there to clean the glass, and they're probably going to be a top 25 offensive rebound rate team in the country. They're much improved, taking care of the ball. Like there's nothing they do wrong. So I see them as the number 1 offense right now.
I love it.
Yeah. I didn't give my bold predictions. I guess I'll give that now. I think I got UConn back to the Final Four. But if they don't get there, this isn't really the bold part, but if they don't get there, it's going to be the front court that is the reason for that. The depth kind of hindering them from getting there. But I think this team can get there.
I really like the bold predictions. But that wraps up this episode. As always, thank you for listening to the Mainly Hoops podcast.